Good morning, I am Dr. Seema and today we will learn about third ventricle. The specific learning objectives of today's class is at the end of the class, students should be able to define the third ventricle and describe its boundaries, and the second objective is to enumerate the recesses of the third ventricle. Third ventricle is the cavity of diencephalon. Now what is this diencephalon? It is that part of the brain which connects the brainstem below to the cerebrum above. And this includes the diencephalon, and it mainly includes thalamus, hypothalamus, metathalamus, epithalamus and subthalamus. And this third ventricle lies between two thalamus and hypothalamus. And you can see that the thalamus of the two cerebral hemispheres are placed very closely. So on a coronal section, you can see the third ventricle as a midline slit-like cavity. Before going into the other details of third ventricle, I would like to show you three diagrams which will help you to have a better orientation of the topic. The first diagram is the anterior view of the brainstem and thalamus. So you can see here, this is the brainstem, this is medulla, pons, and this is the midbrain anterior view. And this is the thalamus above. Now this region is the interpedunculair fossa, which is closely related to the third ventricle. Now we'll just have a look at the structures in the interpedunculair fossa. You can see three eminences over here, two mammillary bodies in front and a tuber cinerarium behind. And you can see a small stalk-like structure which is called as the infundibulum over here. This is the pituitary stalk. And you can even see the optic chiasma over here. And this is the third ventricle. And this diagram is the posterior view of the brainstem and thalamus. And here also again you can see the medulla, pons and midbrain posterior view. And this is the thalamus. And here you will be having the third ventricle, and here you are seeing the pineal gland. And this is the sagittal section of the cerebrum, and you are viewing at the medial surface of the brain. If you have a clear orientation of this picture, it is very easy to learn the boundaries of third ventricle. Now first we will see the structures which you are familiar with first. So this is the corpus callosum, and this is the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and this is the splenium. Now this is the fornix, and hope you remember the body of the fornix will be dividing into two columns, anterior column and posterior column, in front and behind the anterior commissure, and this is the anterior commissure. And if you see, this is the thalamus, the rounded elevation is the thalamus, and the anterior end of it you are seeing the interventricular foramen of Monro, and this is the hypothalamus. And between the thalamus and hypothalamus, you are viewing the hypothalamic sulcus. And there is a thin grey matter which you are seeing here, which extends from the rostrum of the corpus callosum to the optic chiasma. So this is the optic chiasma, and this is a thin grey matter which is extending from rostrum to the optic chiasma, and this is called as the linea terminalis. And next to that you are seeing the pituitary gland, and this is the stalk of pituitary gland which is called as the infundibulum, and this region is called as the tuber cinerarium. And this portion, this is called as the mammillary body, and this is called as the perforated, this is a posterior perforated substance. So all these are the structures which were present in the interpedunculair fossa. Now this is the anterior part of the midbrain which is called the cerebral peduncle, and you can see here it is this portion. The posterior part of the cerebral peduncle is called as the tegmentum of the midbrain. And here this cavity is the cavity of the midbrain which is called as the cerebral aqueduct. And here you can see this is the tectum, and here this is the pineal gland, and you know that the pineal gland is having a stalk which is having a superior lamina and inferior lamina, and in the superior lamina you have the habenular commissure, and in the inferior lamina you have the posterior commissure. Now you can see here this is the splenium, and deep to splenium there is a fissure which is called as the transverse fissure, and through that a vein is coming out. It is a great cerebral vein of Galen, and the branch of posterior cerebral artery which is called as a posterior choroidal artery will be entering to this, and it will be reaching the roof of the third ventricle, and which will be forming the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, which you can see over. If you are thorough with the previous three diagrams, we will see the finer details of the third ventricle. Now we see the extent of third ventricle. It extends anteriorly up to the lamina terminalis and posteriorly it extends up to the commencement of cerebral aqueduct. Now this is the cavity of the third ventricle. You can see that it is having an irregular outline due to the pocket-like extension of the cavity into the neighboring structures. And like other ventricles, the cavity of the third ventricle is also lined by ependymal cells, which is one of the neuroglial cells. And the peculiarity of the cavity of third ventricle is it is traversed by interthalamic adhesion, a grey matter which is connecting the two thalamus. And sometimes this interthalamic adhesion or connexus is misunderstood as an abnormal mass during CT scan. Now we see the communication of the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle, and anteriorly it communicates with the lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro, and posteriorly it communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now we will see the boundaries of the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle, and it is having an anterior wall, a posterior wall, a roof, a floor, and two lateral walls. Now we will see the anterior wall of the third ventricle. The anterior wall is mainly formed from above downwards by anterior column of fornix over here, then by the anterior commissure and the lamina terminalis. And this is the posterior wall of the third ventricle. From above downwards, it is formed by pineal gland and the posterior commissure, which is present in the inferior lamina of the stalk of pineal gland, and the third structure is the commencement of the cerebral aqueduct. Roof of the third ventricle extends from interventricular foramen of Monro and up to the abenular commissure, and it is mainly formed by the ependyma which touches between the two thalamus. This is the third ventricle and this is the thalamus. And the roof is mainly formed by the ependyma which touches between the two thalamus, and above that it is formed by a double layer of pia mater which is called as the tela choroidea. This dotted line represents the double layer of pia mater and which extends onto the roof deep to the splenium through the transverse fissure, and it is even having the choroid plexus in it. Now we will see the floor of the third ventricle, which is mainly formed by the structures which are present in the interpedunculair fossa and the tegmentum of the midbrain. Now, the structures of the interpedunculair fossa are the optic chiasma, then it is the tuber cinereum, infundibulum, which is the stalk of the pituitary gland, then it is a mammillary body, posterior perforated substance, and tegmentum of the midbrain. From before backwards, these structures forms the floor of the third ventricle. Lateral wall of third ventricle. Hypothalamic sulcus divides the lateral wall into two, an upper part and lower part. The upper large part is formed by the medial surface of thalamus, and the smaller lower part is formed by the hypothalamus. Recesses of third ventricle. The cavity of the third ventricle is having pocket-like extension into the neighboring structures, and they are called as the recesses of third ventricle. Third ventricle is having 5 recesses. The first one is the anterior recess. It is otherwise called as the vulva of ventricle. It's a triangular extension between the interventricular foramen of Monro and anterior commissure. So this is the anterior recess. The second recess is the optic or chiasmatic recess, which is seen above the optic chiasma, and it is present at the junction of anterior wall and the floor. The third recess is the infundibular recess, which is an extension of cavity into the infundibulum of pituitary gland. Then posteriorly there are 2 recesses. The first one is the suprapineal recess, which is present above the pineal gland. And the last one is the pineal recess. It is a recess which extends into the stalk of the pineal gland. The double layer of pia mater extending onto the roof of the third ventricle is called as the tela choroidea. And the pia mater is represented by dotted lines, and you can see the 2 layers. And this is the anterior end of the tela choroidea and this is the posterior end. And it is almost having a triangular appearance, and the anterior end is narrow and the posterior end is broad. And between these 2 layers, the posterior choroidal artery enters and it forms the choroid plexus. And you can see these are the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, which is seen in the midline position of the tela choroidea, and it hangs down from here. And you already know that the choroid plexus of the third ventricle will be continuing as the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. The applied aspect. Because the third ventricle is very narrow, it can easily get obstructed by the lesions of the surrounding structures, and it results in hydrocephalus in children and increased intracranial pressure in adults. Then the next applied aspect is the midline shift of the third ventricle. This is a CT scan of the transverse section of the brain, and you can see the yellow colored thing is the third ventricle, and look at the position, it is in the midline region, and any lesion in the surrounding region can give rise to a shift of the third ventricle from the midline. Assignments: draw a neat label diagram and explain the third ventricle under the following headings: definition, location, extent and communication, then the boundaries and recesses of the third ventricle. Thank you and have a nice day.